It seems that everyone is making follow-up videos about the tragic accident involving Air India Flight 171, so I figured I would make one too. This time I will address some issues regarding the flight that could use further discussion. First, anyone who has watched the closed-circuit TV video of the takeoff roll and subsequent crash of the aircraft is aware that at the approximate time that the aircraft lifted off the ground, a gray cloud appeared just below the aircraft and then the cloud drifted off to the left. At least one person has attributed this cloud to being smoke generated by either the left-hand engine, indicating a problem with that engine, or perhaps from locked brakes, explaining why the takeoff run appeared to be longer than normal. Another person has attributed it to smoke from active venting of a thermal runaway event of the auxiliary power unit lithium-ion battery in the tail of the aircraft. I decided to search for an image with a better viewing angle of this cloud. I found the one that you can see on the right side of the page. The cloud is clearly visible behind the aircraft and is obscuring the runway and the ground to the left. Oh wait, this isn't the Air India flight. It's an Emirates 777 taking off. The cloud is just dust being kicked up by either the wake vortex from the wing of the aircraft or perhaps dust kicked up off the runway by the jet blast when the aircraft rotated. In other words, let's move along. Nothing to see. There is a question about exactly what is logged by the EAFR, Enhanced Aircraft Flight Recorder, regarding the fuel control switches. One person has stated that, quote, the sensor for the fuel cutoff is not on the switch but on the fuel cutoff valve. It is the state of the valve that is recorded, unquote. That might be true for other aircraft, but it is not true for a 787. I have located a couple of figures showing the circuit diagram. The one shown here comes from a video by Stig Aviation. The fuel control switch is a 4-pole design, meaning that such a switch can operate 4 independent signal lines in parallel. The figure shows that one of these lines goes directly into an RDC, a remote data concentrator, which then goes onto the common data network, which is where both the EAFR and the electronic engine control get information regarding the state of the switch. In this case, the sensor is not on some cutoff valve, it is the switch itself. I also found another diagram with more detail showing that the switch closes a circuit in which a line from the 28-volt DC supply goes through a down converter to 14 volts and thence to an LED, a light-emitting diode, in an opto-isolator, and from there to the switch itself. In essence, the fuel control switch operates a circuit very much like a wall switch in your house, turning a light bulb on or off. Pretty basic. The rat deployment. This topic has resulted in many people becoming engaged in what one person has described as hamster-esque wheel spinning, trying to figure out when the rat was deployed. The key question is, how long does it take the rat to deploy and provide hydraulic power? You can find people quoting values ranging from 4 to 10 seconds with no explanation of where these numbers came from. Jeff Ostroff tried to use ChatGPT, and it cited values of 4 to 5 seconds based on, among other sources, Safety Airworthiness Information Bulletin number NM-1833. Now the actual bulletin is NM-18-33, but that is the bulletin telling operators to check the fuel cutoff switches and has nothing to do with the rat. Yet another example of why you can trust ChatGPT. Fahad Naeem, an aircraft engineer who works at Ho Chi Minh Airport in Vietnam, is endorsed by Stig Aviation, and Simon Hradecki, who runs the Aviation Herald website, both apparently have access to the relevant Boeing manual describing the rat function, and both give the same information. The full rated hydraulic power is available in 6 seconds max and electrical power in 10 seconds max from the command, which by my reading is the command to initiate deployment of the rat. The preliminary report references closed-circuit TV footage showing the rat getting deployed, quote, immediately after liftoff, unquote, but the photo itself was taken 10 seconds after liftoff, making the term immediately ambiguous. The report then states that at 08:08:47, the rat hydraulic pump, quote, began supplying hydraulic power, unquote. Most people have interpreted this statement as meaning that it is supplying full hydraulic power, thus implying that the rat must have been deployed 6 seconds earlier at about 08:08:41, which is before the fuel control switches were moved to the cutoff position, and thus implying that there was a problem with the aircraft unrelated to the fuel control switches and which was already underway at or around the time of liftoff. Why the preliminary report makes no mention of such a critical problem is not explained. In the alternative, it is possible that the rat was producing detectable hydraulic power well before reaching the maximum, and then that is what the report meant. Thus, it is possible that the command to deploy the rat came as late as, say, 08:08:45, in which case the fuel cutoff could very well have been the trigger for the rat deployment. At this point in time, we simply need to wait for more information from the AAIB than we currently have. One person has suggested that water ingress into the EE bay caused a short circuit leading to total electrical failure and was the true cause of the early deployment of the rat. This person has repeatedly pointed to Airworthiness Directive AD 2025-09-12 and questions whether Air India had implemented it in the aircraft at issue, suggesting that Air India's inattention to maintenance may have been a factor. However, if you read the AD carefully, it points out that the root cause for the directive occurred in 2018. The aircraft involved in the crash is built in 2013. Don't think that particular directive applies here. I uncovered a few new interesting bits of information about the ADS-B data from Flight Radar 24. First, while I didn't discover previously, the ADS-B data have rather spotty coverage. The data start at 07:48:33 while the plane was still on the ground and possibly while it was still at the gate, continue for about 16 minutes while the plane was taxiing, then there's a gap of over 4 minutes, and finally picks up again for 8 seconds, of which only the penultimate 4 seconds, 8 data points total, have usable data. The 4-minute gap happens to be the time during which the plane backtracked on the runway to its initial start point at the northeast end. This gap led some people to think that the plane had conducted an intersection takeoff, thus using only half the runway, but that was not the case. From listening to a podcast by FR24 describing the accident, I learned that FR24 has only partial ADS-B coverage of the runway. For those who are not aware, flight tracker websites like FR24 depend on a network of volunteers to operate ADS-B receivers and send the data back to the website's servers, and thus coverage is limited to what the volunteers are able to provide. My guess is that there is a single ADS-B receiver in the international terminal, and that data were collected only when the aircraft was in range of this particular receiver and its antenna. One person tried to associate the timing of the last ADS-B broadcast with the timing for the RAT deployment to supply electrical power, but it is possible that the data ceased simply due to the plane leaving the coverage area of the receiver. From looking at FR24 ADS-B data for recent 787 flights taking off from or landing at Ahmedabad Airport, it appears that ADS-B coverage is fine while the plane is above a pressure altitude of about 600 feet, but mostly ceases when the plane is below, even if it is close to or over the runway. Air India 171 may have begun descending at that time of the last ADS-B point, which may have been the reason that it moved out of the coverage zone of the receiver. One last interesting facet can be gleaned from the ADS-B data. If one plots the positions from the 8 data points where the plane was in the air over the runway, they all lie to the left of the runway center line, and the track that they form has a slightly different bearing than that of the center line itself. The offset is about 12 feet at the start and 36 feet at the end. The corresponding angular deviation from the center line is about 1 degree, which is consistent with a crosswind of about 3 knots and an average plane speed of 175 knots. Thus, it is likely that we are observing the plane being blown to the left after liftoff by a mild crosswind, which the meteorological records show was between 1 and 4 knots at that time of day. The final topic is a review of past dual-engine shutdowns or failures. The more you look, the more cases you find. Here I list just a few examples of the many cases that I found, such as British Airways Flight 38, where extremely low temperatures over Siberia caused ice to form in the fuel lines and led to a crash as the plane was trying to land. The TCMA incident with All Nippon Airways Flight 985, another TCMA incident, this time with an Air Baltic Airbus 220, the Air Transat 236 fuel leak incident, the Gimli glider, the Miracle on the Hudson, and so forth. One could also add in instances where one engine failed and the pilots accidentally shut down the one remaining good engine. How one wants to categorize these incidents is a matter of choice. I picked 3 categories. 1. Pilot action or other human error was required to trigger the shutdown. All the TCMA cases involved the pilot doing something well outside of standard operating procedures and thus triggering the system. Pilot action was also the key factor for wrong engine shutdowns. The Gimli glider incident could be partially attributed to human error by whoever refueled the aircraft. 2. Environmental. cold temperatures, fuel contamination, volcanic ash, a flock of geese, etc. In some cases, one can argue that the plane was at fault, while in others, the circumstances were entirely external to the aircraft. 3. Fuel exhaustion, usually due to an aircraft fault, although in one case it was due to miscommunications between the pilot and air traffic control. Category 1, pilot action or human error, figures in about half the cases. Category 2, environmental, figures in most of the rest. Finally, fuel exhaustion was a factor in only a few cases. In general, dual engine failures are due to factors external to the engines and do not involve failures of either the FADEC or the electronic engine control, the exception being single engine failures followed by shutting down the wrong engine. They span both Boeing and Airbus aircraft about equally. Another class of failures that need to be checked more thoroughly are cases where there is a major electrical fault. I'm aware of at least 3 cases where electrical power was lost completely, and for 2 of them, the flight finished on either RAT or battery power alone. In none of those cases did the engines shut down. In my last video, I highlighted Mary Schiavo's willingness to give interviews as a way of drumming up business for her law firm Motley Rice. However, she's been scooped by the law firm Beasley Allen. Families of at least 85 of the victims have hired this law firm to represent them. The firm is led by its chief ambulance chaser, Mike Andrews, not to be confused with a former second baseman for the Boston Red Sox. Mike has given several extensive interviews in the past few weeks with various news agencies in India, also drumming up business, which he seems to be doing quite successfully. Here I will comment on a couple of those interviews, one with Asia News International, ANI, and which can be found on the website formerly known as Twitter, and another more recent interview with the Indian Express, which can be found on that publication's website. Regarding the fuel control switches, here is what Mike has to say, and I am paraphrasing slightly. Quote, "As you know, the early indications are that those switches, they've said, were moved. Here's what we don't know. We don't know if the switches actually moved or if the current changed and made it look like a movement. So the computer in this plane is looking at the current that is flowing. We know that the computer system on board the 787 is extremely complicated, extraordinarily complex." End quote. No, Mike, that extraordinarily complex computer system is not involved in sensing the current or position of those switches. The current is sensed not by a computer, but by a light bulb. Mike is using a classic technique often employed by attorneys in which you cast suspicion on an opponent by the use of innuendo and unsupported allegations. This technique is also known as spreading FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It is also a technique used by law enforcement at all levels. When you don't have an open and shut case, you dig up any and all dirt on a suspect, no matter whether it is relevant to the crime or not, and use it to obtain search warrants and indictments from unsuspecting judges and grand juries. Mike continues, quote, "And this plane is equipped with a throttle control malfunctioning system. In other words, if the plane thinks the throttle is malfunctioning, it can turn the fuel back. It can cut power to the engines. We know there was at least one other incident in 2019, the All Nippon case, in which a 787 coming in on landing suffered an engine failure, both engines, but the plane was able to land." Mike has swiped Mary Schiavo's storyline and made it his own. Like Mary, he has no clue what the system is intended for. He can't even get the name straight. Mike, it's called the Thrust Control Malfunction Accommodation System, TCMA, and it does not deal with throttle malfunctions. It deals with engine malfunctions, and specifically UHT, uncontrolled high thrust situations while the plane is on the ground. In the ANA incident, the engine cutoff did not happen while the plane was coming in for a landing. The plane was already firmly planted on the ground. Did the engines fail? Here's what the airline's own report on the incident had to say. The carrier said it conducted a thorough investigation of the aircraft and found no engine failure. From another interview, Mike says this about the same incident. Quote, "It was revealed that the TCMA system, Thrust Control Malfunction Accommodation System, malfunctioned." End quote. Mike finally figured out the proper name of the system. Did it malfunction? Here again is what the airline report had to say. An appropriate safeguard system on the 787 was activated properly on both engines, triggering the discontinuation of the thrust. Mike continues, quote, "Even though both engines suffered power failure and even though it was determined that the computer dialed it back, one big distinction here is that those pilots were not blamed because those pilots are still alive. And so in this case, Air India, we think it is highly speculative and a rush to judgment to blame the pilots of this case who cannot speak for themselves." Unquote. Mike has gone native, spoon-feeding the Indian press the storyline that it wants to hear, regardless of whether it is accurate or drivel. The Air India pilots are dead, so we can put the blame on them. But the ANA pilots are alive, so we can't blame them, right? Not really. There was never an official investigation into the ANA incident in the first place, hence there was never any blame to assign. ANA conducted its own investigation but did not assign responsibility. However, the Japanese can be extremely subtle and indirect when it comes to delivering a message, and if you read their statements in this incident more carefully, you can discern what ANA is really saying. The pilots are out of line. The reality is that Boeing had just issued a bulletin saying, don't do that with the thrust reversers, but the ANA cowboy pilots did it anyway. The issue was specific to Trent engines not used by Air India, and the TCMA system has since been altered to be more tolerant of cowboy pilots. But Mike is standing up for the pilots. How noble. Now let's check out Beasley Allen's website. What does it say about not blaming the pilots? Quote, accidents still occur, sometimes with tragic consequences. The leading cause of these crashes is human error, often involving pilots and flight crews. Unquote. In other words, we stand up for the pilots except when we throw them under the bus. Elsewhere on the website, Beasley Allen quotes the preliminary report as follows. Quote, one pilot asked, quote, why did you cut off the fuel? Unquote. The other responded, quote, I did not do so. Unquote. Beasley Allen is quoting verbatim from the report. Right? No. The preliminary report merely paraphrased the conversation, and for all we know, it could have been conducted in Hindi. Beasley Allen has materially altered this section of the report to present it as if the two pilots were being quoted directly. The words, the fuel, are not in the report, and thus Beasley Allen has deliberately misrepresented the conversation, putting words into the mouth of one of the pilots that he did not actually say. Mike was asked, quote, why are you fighting this case, unquote. His immediate reply was, quote, aviation safety, unquote. I decided to see what accomplishments in aviation safety are highlighted on Beasley Allen's homepage. There are none. Instead, one finds copious references to dollar signs, millions and billions of them, all secured in either settlements or verdicts. And for the record, I am not a lawyer.